Welcome back. This is part 1 of the series, going over the basics and history of animation. So the basic idea of animation is to create the illusion of movement by showing the viewer a lot of still images in a row. Historically speaking, this has been attempted even way back in the 19th century. Devices with very complicated names like the phenakistiscope or the zoopraxiscope, where the viewer or the user would manually spin some kind of a disk, and by doing so the handful of images that were drawn on a disk would appear to be moving. Toward the end of the century and into the 20th century, with the advent of film projection, animation started leveling up as well. So instead of a spinning disk with only a handful of pictures, you now had significantly more frames at your disposal. Instead of a single action, longer animation sequences and even actual animated storylines could now be created. While in retrospect this technology was a seriously amazing achievement, it still took quite some time before animations could break away from just being funny gimmicks. So then what happened? How did animation go from this to being one of the most popular forms of entertainment media? Well, there was this company called Disney. In the early 1900s, the Walt Disney Studio did an insane amount of pioneer work in the field of animation. In 1928, they made the animated short Steamboat Willie, which was a pretty huge deal. The first feature-length animated movie in history was also made by Disney in 1937. It was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And only 3 years later the highly influential Fantasia was released. There is actually a really interesting story about how Fantasia inadvertently kickstarted the Japanese animation industry during the Second World War. Fantasia is basically the reason why anime exists today. So I do recommend that you look into how that whole thing happened. It's quite a fascinating series of events. Anyway, by the time the 1940s rolled around, animation had finally found its place in the world, and it was largely thanks to Disney. A lot of other studios started popping up worldwide. The whole thing started branching out more and more. But Disney's head start in the race was just too much, and they just kept dominating the industry decade after decade. So like I mentioned before, Disney was doing pioneer work. They were figuring out the ins and outs of hand-drawn animation by themselves, developing new technologies, techniques. Fast forward to 1981, and Disney decides it's finally time to let the rest of the world in on their secrets. Two of their senior animators, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, authored a book called Disney Animation: The Illusion of Life. This book would go on to be nicknamed the Animation Bible and become the basis of animation academia practically everywhere. The book itself is pretty long-winded, including chronicles of the Walt Disney Company, anecdotes about the man himself, Walt, his personality, style of leadership, and so on. What earned it the title of Animation Bible is actually just a rather small segment where the 12 principles of animation are laid out. That's right, 12 rules that together are the key to creating lifelike and Disney-esque animation. Now, there are lots of good educational resources online about the 12 principles, and I especially recommend watching a video series on YouTube by Alan Becker Tutorials. He goes way more in depth with the explanations and demonstrations than I possibly could in these videos. That said, let's quickly go over the big 12. Number 1 is squash and stretch, means deforming a shape based on momentum. This first one is one of the most important. It's pretty obvious if you are animating something like a bouncy rubber ball. The squash and stretch happens in real life too. A rubber ball doesn't retain a perfect spherical shape all the time, but rather it squashes when it hits the ground with force, and then in turn stretches when it bounces upwards again. What's less obvious is that you should also apply this effect with objects that aren't squishy or stretchy in real life. like the human head. If a character turns their head super fast, deforming the shape of the head momentarily adds a sense of fluidity and speed. Number 2, anticipation. Very big actions need some time to wind up. Once again, this is in line with real life. When a person jumps, they do not immediately lift off the ground. Instead, they wind up by going into a squat. If such a wind-up doesn't exist, the movement will appear to be extremely unnatural. A good wind-up also gives the viewer time to realize what's going to happen. After all, this rule is literally called anticipation. So we want the viewer to be able to anticipate. Number 3, staging. Pretty simple. You can only have so many things going on at the same time before a scene becomes confusing to watch. Humans can only look at one thing at a time, so put the relevant thing on the front and center and try not to take attention away from it needlessly. Staging can also mean how you pose a character. A good pose is one that the viewer can understand quickly and easily, even from a silhouette. Number 4, straight ahead and pose to pose. To be honest, I don't know what this is doing on the list. It's not really a principle, more like a method or technique of drawing frames of animation. Straight ahead means you draw one frame at a time. Frame 1, then frame 2, frame 3, in chronological order. Works out well for quickly shape-shifting things like flames or rising smoke. With pose to pose, on the other hand, you choose to draw the so-called keyframes or key poses. For example, you draw frame 1, then frame 5, and then frame 10. And then when you've got a clear idea of what the entire action looks like, you go back and draw the in-between frames. Personally, I go with pose to pose most of the time when animating characters doing things like punching and kicking. It just works out better. Number 5, follow through and overlapping action. Follow through is yet another realistic one. It's basically reverse anticipation. When you have a big action, like a character throwing a baseball really fast, the movement doesn't stop when the ball leaves the hand. Instead, the character should take some time to recover from this powerful movement before returning to a balanced and relaxed state. The bigger the action, the longer the anticipation and the follow-through. Overlapping action describes things like hair and articles of clothing moving with a different timing from the center mass. A classic example would be a character with long hair turning their head quickly. While the head comes to a full stop, the hair will continue moving around for a long time before returning to a relaxed state. Number 6, slow in and slow out. This is also called easing. Unless you're dealing with mechanical objects like robots, things don't usually move at a perfectly constant rate. Instead, they accelerate and decelerate somewhere along the way. We can illustrate these changes in speed with curves that look something like this, where the horizontal axis describes time passing and the vertical axis describes how far into the action we are in. This curve could be for an axe that swings down and hits a log, very slowly accelerating and reaching maximum velocity just before stopping abruptly. This curve would be fitting for a football that gets kicked and then slowly rolls to a stop. It's really important to recognize which kind of curve fits which action, otherwise you could end up with some funny results. Number 7, arcs. This principle applies especially well to animating human characters. Due to our anatomy and joints and whatnot, humans tend to move along circular paths. Take a simple walk cycle, for example. Every body part from head to toe is doing its own little movement arc, like swinging of the arms from the elbow down, or the head bobbing slightly with each step. It's something that we don't usually pay attention to as viewers, but if the arcs were not there, it would be painfully obvious and awkward looking. Number 8, secondary action. Here's an interesting one. The idea is that when portraying an action, you can add personality and expressiveness into it by incorporating a subtle secondary action that is kind of layered on top of the primary one. So you'd have, for example, the main action, which is a guy yawns and stretches. But if you really want to emphasize a bit more how sleepy and groggy the guy is, well, also have him scratch his head at the same time. Number 9, timing. Timing can be thought of as a companion to staging. Actions and events should take place in such a rhythm that the viewer always catches the important bits. It can also be related simply to the duration of an action. A person looking up very slowly can seem very ominous, but the exact same action can communicate surprise and reflex reaction if it's sped up way more. Number 10, exaggeration. While many of these principles are based on realism and imitating real-world physics, this one is the opposite. It's actually very important for making an interesting and fun animation. In real life, it's not often that you see a car go on 2 wheels while cornering at high speed, even in like rally races. But in cartoony car chases, it happens all the time. It's exciting and entertaining, and that's why it exists. Animated facial expressions can also be turned up to 11, maybe for comedic effect. Number 11, solid drawing. This one deals more with general drawing skill. Solid drawing means that even though you're working with 2D images, you have a good grasp of depth and three-dimensionality. And finally, there is number 12, appeal. And it's another odd one in the group, again not directly related to animation, but rather character design in general. Whoever or whatever your character is, try to give them a unique and expressive design by messing around with exaggerated proportions, and just give them something that makes them interesting and memorable. Okay, that just about does it on the topic of history of animation and the 12 principles. Join me in part 2, where we are going to finally get our hands dirty and start doing some animations of our own in Adobe's Animate.